Welcome to episode 22 of An Understanding. This episode will be about Grover Cleveland. If you like it, listen. If you don't, eat biscuits. Hope you guys enjoy. March 4th, 1893. Grover Cleveland is inaugurated into the White House. Technically speaking, he is the first Democratic president elected into the White House since James Buchanan, all the way back in 1856. Andrew Johnson wasn't elected. He took over once Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. This one is a little bit different, though. This one's a little bit special. Because you see, this is technically his second term. Grover Cleveland was once initially inaugurated on March 4th, 1885, in the election of 1884, in which he became the first Democratic president since James Buchanan to be elected into the White House. This is important because Grover Cleveland is the first president in this country's history to serve two non-consecutive terms, something unprecedented within this country's history. Although, depending on what might happen in terms of the political climate of today's America, Trump might be the second one. Who knows? What happens in 4 years? A lot of things can change. A lot of things can turn. But for Grover Cleveland, this is a very special day. His wife, when they left the White House after losing the election of 1888, 1889, swore that they would return. Not only did that come to fruition, but it came into fruition under very unique circumstances and a very unique time within this country's history. When things were down, things were looking bad, the country turned to Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland is this country's 22nd and 24th president of the United States of America. And I do apologize for that very short opening. I just wanted to make this real quick and start getting things out much quicker than I normally do. Grover Cleveland's a very interesting president for numerous reasons. I mean, if you look at Grover Cleveland today, most people would probably think he's a Republican, just based off of his ideological ideals, the way he leaned, everything that he would go against in his presidency with labor, etc., etc. I think he might have been one of the very few Democrats that actually would have been for the gold standard during this particular point in time. Grover Cleveland is, in my personal view, the last vestige of the Democratic Party, at least the old Democratic Party, before, to a certain extent, depending on what history books you read and depending on your personal perspective, the Democrats' aggressive shift towards liberalism and the ideas of liberal perspective. He really is the last one, and I think it's very fascinating that he ends up becoming the president twice. First term being a bit tumultuous, and then Benjamin Harrison takes over, and then he wins the election once more. Grover Cleveland is going to be a very fascinating episode that we're going to be doing. He comes in at a very unique point within this country's history. In a lot of ways, he's probably the last president before America's legitimate push into foray, I guess you could say, in terms of being an interventionalist nation and country. Although he himself wasn't anti-interventionalist, but he probably would be considered the last one specifically. Grover Cleveland is just a fascinating person, when you look at him in terms of just the historical context, his entire life, up and down, yada yada, everything about Grover Cleveland, it's really thoroughly fascinating. You look at, for instance, and I hate these things, but top 10 lists of all the greatest presidents of all time, and you won't find a much more conflicting disparity between what is a good president and what is a bad president. John Tyler's probably along the lines of that same vein. For Grover Cleveland, though, it just depends. If you're a liberal-minded individual, you're probably going to rank him less, and if you're much more of a conservative-minded or libertarian-minded individual, you might rank him a little bit higher, might rank him even higher. And it really depends. He's also kind of a badass in the sense that there's one story that I'll detail later on, when he's basically going to be forced to get surgery on his jaw for many different reasons, but sickness effectively, and basically ends up just getting his jaw replaced, goes back as if nothing happened, and little things like that kind of just show you the strength of character that particular individual's face. Grover Cleveland being the first president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. It's really interesting how I'm going to be able to do this episode, and it's going to be a bit of a challenge, but we shall see, and we shall go into this foray. Grover Cleveland, though, I personally am more indifferent to him than anything else. There's a lot of good that he did, and there's a lot of bad that he did. And ultimately, his presidency comes at probably one of the most unique junctions in this country's history. And I say that with everybody, but, for him, he's effectively going to cover for the better part between his presidency, Harrison's presidency, etc., between a very fascinating point of about 12 years within this country's history where America's functionally changed and the world's changed. Cars are going to start becoming an actual thing. Men like Henry Ford and all them. The future is now. In a lot of ways, it really starts with Grover Cleveland. So I hope you guys like it, listen, and let's get started with Grover Cleveland's childhood. Stephen Grover Cleveland was born on March 18th, 1837 to Anne Neal, and Richard Foley Cleveland. His father was a Yale-educated Presbyterian minister, born in Caldwell, New Jersey, the 5th of 9 children. Now, Grover Cleveland, basically when he was born, wasn't rolling in wealth by any stretch of the imagination. His father was a pretty strong person, but ultimately wasn't as financially liquid as most people would be. I mean, especially when you have 9 children, you got a lot of mouths to feed. His name was Stephen, ultimately, but most people would end up calling him Grover. I think he was named after the first minister of the church that I went to in Caldwell, New Jersey, and were the same church that his father would basically pastor on for most of his early life. Now, Grover, growing up, at least on the initial goings, was it wasn't tedious. He wasn't like broke by any stretch of the imagination, but there are times where he would have to forego an education at the local schools in order for him to actually survive, because he would have to work and help out the family. In fact, when he would eventually grow up, he'd be working with his brother and traveling, moving from place to place. You find similarities with a lot of these presidents who continually, especially when they grow up, they never settle in one particular location, which I find quite interesting. So growing up for Grover Cleveland was pretty interesting. Had a normal childhood, relatively speaking, to most kids. Most kids would work, I guess you could say middle to lower class childhood, economically speaking, growing up. His family history is pretty interesting. He has direct relatives, I think, that fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill, little things like that, in various parts of the Revolutionary War. And he's born around the time of John Tyler's presidency, William Henry Harrison's presidencies, etc., etc. It's around this, not William Henry Harrison, Martin Van Buren, during this particular time. So he was born post-Jacksonian America, I guess, because Jackson's gone by this point when he's born. Cleveland was a bit of a rambunctious young man. Today, I think he'd be considered like a bit of a troll. He's kind of the type of individual who would leave a bag of doggy doo-doo at your door and light it on fire. He's always rambunctious like that, but play pranks on all his neighbors, etc., wherever he lived. Initially born in New Jersey, his family, when he was about 5 or 6, would move him to Fayetteville in New York, where his father would, father trying to find work. You know how it goes. He's a pretty interesting relationship with his parents. Not great, not bad. Most of these presidents have relatively boring relationships with their parents. He just did what he did, was a doting son, mother very strong, and a father very strong too, but, they weren't very liquid in any way, shape, and form. Now for Grover Cleveland, Stephen Grover Cleveland, he just enjoyed life. He loved the outdoors, playing pranks. He loved sports. Was a big advocate of outdoor sports. I think it's really interesting, just growing up, young man, and post-Jacksonian America, Mexican-American War is about to be coming up when he's about basically 10 years old. And, I always find it very interesting that, these presidents, they're born during these particular moments in history. And they're there when history happens and unfolds. So for Grover Cleveland, growing up as well, ideologically and politically speaking, it's very fascinating because New York around this time is still kind of like Martin Van Buren's state, at least to a certain extent, although it's in the North and they're relatively not pro-slavery. So it's most assumptions would probably think that it's a pro-Republican kind of thing for him, and it's really not that at all. His family would be, relatively speaking, I don't want to say from the very beginnings of his origins, but the family would probably have voted Democrat at that point. He was influenced by a lot of things that he saw around that particular point in time, and I think I kind of try to look at it from his interpersonal perspective. Imagine growing up. All the compromises, like compromise of 1850 with slavery, the Civil War's political unrest that's coming up within the country itself, Kansas Act, all that stuff that he's going to be growing into. How people will ideologically align from that perspective. And a lot of people, ultimately, at least in the early goings of the Civil War, saw it as, federal versus states' rights, et cetera, and I would probably believe that around that time, he just saw a lot of the people, hung out with a lot of people that align with that particular political ideology. And his presidency would actually prove that, for the most part, to be relatively true. He's probably, genuinely speaking, the last legitimate, I don't want to say conservative, but very much aligned with the Jacksonian ideals of what the Democratic Party represented, states' rights, et cetera, kind of just try and let people do what they want, relatively speaking, for the most part, without federal or national intervention. So, continuing back to his childhood, growing up, Grover Cleveland's just basically like, yo, man, it's all lit here. We're just doing our thing, y'all. You know what I'm saying? He's moving place to place. His father struggled to find consistent work. The closest thing he found was when he went to Clinton, New York, working as basically a secretary minister of the specific church that he went to, or the specific society that he had joined. I think it was the American Home Missionary Society, and things became difficult. Although Grover would actually like Clinton, he would go back there effectively at a certain point in his life in a couple years during his childhood. So, again, financial conditions make things difficult, and for Grover Cleveland, it became, especially back then, more feasible for him to get an apprenticeship than go to school. So, most of his early education's at times going to school whenever he could, but for the most part, he never really had a solid, consistent education. He wasn't dumb, but he was basically much more in that mold and mindset of non-liberal ideals and stuff. So, which I'm not saying that if one is a liberal person that is like, oh, you're all dumb or don't know anything. It's more so, I think he looked at life from an objective reality perspective and ultimately lived his life in an objective reality perspective. So, I think it's interesting because the presidents that don't have education speaking, tended to probably lean more in terms of a restrictive, old school conservative lifestyle than one of liberal principles and responsibilities when they become either a politician or a president. But for him, while in Clinton, New York, got an opportunity to do a 2-year apprenticeship working for a merchant. When he moved back after leaving Clinton, he went back to Fayetteville. That's where he got the actual apprenticeship to work for a merchant and learn, I think, invaluably, finances for the most part, how the entire economy works. Similar to like how Alexander Hamilton got most of his economic upbringing. Because Hamilton himself was basically running an entire shipping company by the time he was 15, and for Grover Cleveland, he's like, oh, so this is basic economics. Sorry, I got saliva went down the wrong hole, having difficulties here. So while doing his internship, I guess you could say his apprenticeship with the merchant, he really understood the finer things in life, at least to a certain extent. He lived at least in relative comparison to his initial upbringing, pretty lavishly, for the most part. Really understood in a lot of ways, really understood what it took to really make it in life, which is invaluable beyond reasonable doubt for him. So once he finishes his apprenticeship, he decides to go and move away from the family, which was very difficult for the family for both financial reasons and emotional reasons. A good son, etc., etc. But ultimately, he just wanted to pursue other things. He starts looking into law. He starts looking into just whatever he wants to do in his life. So 1853, he ends up leaving Fayetteville and goes back to Clinton and basically begins finishing what he wanted to start, which was basically school. So for 15, 16-year-old Grover Cleveland, it was invaluable for him to basically go to school. But then things become a little bit difficult too. 1852, around that time, as he's leaving, his father gets sick, unfortunately. Around his 15th, 16th birthday, 1852, 1853, a whole bunch of different things, are specified on what he actually probably could have died of. He will die in 1853. He had, some say, gastric ulcer, basically just some diverticulism, whatever you want to call it. I should know this. I'm going to medical school. But anyways, basically dies of really bad stomach problems. And for Grover Cleveland, it was very difficult because he was just basically like, darn it. So he then goes to New York City itself with his older brother. His older brother is working, I believe, as a clerk, and he actually ends up getting an opportunity to work in a clerkship while working part-time as well, or at least part-time working at a clerkship, and basically begins, or at least attempts to begin, a career in law. So in New York City, he's with his brother. What was his brother? His brother's name was William Cleveland. His brother was working for the New York Institute for the Blind at the time, and got him a job as an assistant teacher while doing his clerk stuff. And things became difficult because I think he really wanted to study law and focus on law and really do something in that career trajectory. Because a lot of people back then, everyone wanted to be a lawyer, everyone wanted to work in some sort of business, and everyone was trying to make that money and get political and societal influence. You know how it goes back then, politics. Am I right? So anyways, he ends up working there for about a year and a half, and he really wants to go to school. He really wants to get it done, get it started. Most of his education has just been with small academies, whether it was the Fayetteville Academy, Clinton, I think it's called the Clinton Liberal Academy, and the two places that he predominantly got most of his education. Stephen Grover Cleveland wanted to continue and try and do law. So after about 2 years in New York City, he actually got an offer from a similar minister group because of his father's influence, that they would actually pay for his education if he promised to be a minister. And he's like, nah, I'm not going to do that. So he just says, screw it. And then he goes west in New York and goes to Buffalo, I believe, in 1855. So at first, in moving to Buffalo, he meets his guy. Well, that's not really a guy. He finally gets to meet his uncle. His uncle's name is Lewis F. Allen. He worked for this law firm, Rogers, Bowen, and Rogers. Some little tidbits. I think Millard Fillmore had actually clerked there before previously, the former 13th president of the United States. And, he basically worked there full-time, basically, as a clerk, which is good for him because then he was able to study law, and he worked hard for the next 4-ish years just trying to do whatever he possibly could in order to get his law degree. Not law degree, but be admitted to the bar. And actually, in fact, I think he's the only other president that didn't graduate from college. Might have been Abraham Lincoln. I'm not sure, going off the top of my head, but effectively speaking, Grover Cleveland, he goes full bore into it. He just accepts it. He's like, I want to be a lawyer. This is what I want to do. And, again, being a lawyer is really good, and a lot of financial potential income because people hate each other. You know how it goes. And ultimately, works hard, works with the law, and begins reading law with them, but going to various different cases, participating in various different cases. And by 1859, Grover Cleveland ultimately ends up passing and graduating from his bar, or the New York State Bar exam. Now he's a full-fledged lawyer in 1859, and honestly, the future is really bright for young Grover Cleveland. So for Grover Cleveland, passing the bar was great for him. He really wanted to become the lawyer, etc., and stuck with the law firm that his uncle's law firm for the most part, at least for 2-3 years. Really just making a name for himself, becoming a really prominent lawyer within New York itself. And around this time that he's graduating from the state bar, the Civil War is basically on the precipice. So when he's a lawyer, he becomes a lawyer during the actual Civil War itself. It actually becomes a bit of an issue for Grover Cleveland. At a certain point during the Civil War and the early goings of it, he serves as an assistant district attorney for Erie County, and a lot of people will call him a slacker and use certain things for him avoiding the war. I should probably go back. He avoids military service during the conscription period, and he was of fighting age. He's about in his early 20s, and he's making a lot of money for himself, so he ends up hiring a substitute for like $200-300 in order to supplement his position within the Union Army. And ultimately, his political opponents in the future would label him a slacker for evading the draft, effectively. Little things like that. But for Grover Cleveland, this is about him going, through the stepping stones of what effectively will be his future career. So he leaves around after 2 years in 1861, 1862 to start his own practice. And then while he's getting his practice off the ground, he's given an opportunity to be the assistant district attorney of Erie County. Civil War rages on. Conscription Act passes 1863. And ultimately, life will never be the same for Grover Cleveland for many different reasons. He's on his own. He's his own lawyer. And at this time, whether he wanted to or not, I don't know if he truly wanted to, but everyone wanted to, let's just be honest, because it's politics. But ultimately, his name is going to be within the political scene, and ultimately Grover Cleveland is going to be within the political sphere. He's away from his family. He's making a name for himself, and life will never be the same for young Grover Cleveland, who at this particular point is probably one of the more successful sons of his father's brood, I guess you could say, his father, Richard. And ultimately, he kind of becomes a bit of the face of his own family. And ultimately, in the future, will become the face of the Democratic Party. Dun, dun, dun.